Hi, and welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you. Before we get going and talk about your book, I'm curious about this. I know people have been baking bread during this pandemic. I know people that have found one recipe that works for themselves throughout this pandemic. Do you have one? Do you have one thing that you found yourself cooking more than anything else during these few months?
Yeah, I mean, just vegetarian food in general. In the middle of the pandemic, the lines to the store were long, and in the beginning, there was no delivery. So I used to go at least 3 days, 4 days a week to get the groceries for the family. And it was such a long line to the protein desk. So I was like, screw it. I'm a chef. I can figure this out. So we went vegetarian for a good 3, 4 months, and it was great. It was cleansing.
Are you going to stick with it?
I have already, but I would say probably 60-40 now, at least 60-40, I would say.
How's your year been? This is a strange way of putting it, but how's your pandemic been?
Well, thank you for asking. We have a 4-year-old, my wife and I. Zion is 4. So it's all about how can we create a routine for him. Those first months in March and April, when the playgrounds were closed, the schools were closed, it was very difficult for him to get normal, right? So now at least he's actually back to school. The playgrounds are open. We created a routine around him, and our block shut down. So all the parents did this pod thing where we shared, someone is a teacher of expert of X, and I'm a chef. So everybody shared their skill set. So the kids had a normal summer and fall. So that's been the silver lining. So from that lens, we're now doing much better. Other than that, it's been the toughest year of my life. Friends of mine have passed away. Friends of mine got COVID, in and out of the hospital. Many friends have closed their restaurant for good. So it's just been tough to navigate the emotional and the mental. And of course, with the racial conversation and culture conversation we have in this country, that it's a long road, but it looks like we're heading in the right direction.
Well, I'm excited to talk about some of these things in the context of the book. But first, let's get a little bit about you here, because this book is sort of an index of the Black culinary tradition. Before we get into the particulars here, you were born in Ethiopia, you were raised in Sweden. At what point did you become familiar with the African-American culinary tradition?
I would say Black culture was ingrained in our family, not through food, but through pop culture, right? My parents listened to Marvin Gaye and Miles and Stevie. Stevie was my first concert with my mom and my sisters. Prince and Michael was played in my room, my sister's room. So in terms of Black excellence, it was always through American pop culture and a little bit of Africa, a little bit Maria Makeba, a little bit Fela Kuti, and of course Bob. But and then eventually we got books like Alex Haley, Malcolm, Toni Morrison. So it was all there, James Baldwin. And eventually when I got here, I started to study the food, but it took me a long time.
What did you notice?
I started to see the similarities between West African cooking, I think first. Started to ask questions, But then it was also very strange for me because as a young chef working in Midtown, I was invited to all these great places, but I also saw that I was almost always the only one, whether it was at a big cooking event. And I knew so many great Black cooks and chef friends. And as a Black person, the last word you want to pull from is racism, right? You want to think it's coincidence. You want to think it's, maybe they don't know each other. You don't want to go. That's the last word you pull out of the pantry, But then eventually these isms are here, and how do you as a chef deal with it?
In this book, it's a great collaborative effort you have here between Black chefs, between people making incredible Black food in the United States. How did you decide who you wanted to profile, who you wanted to feature?
Well, Usai and Yawanda make the recipes, and Usai is the writer. We were very clear on that this is not a list of who's in and who's out. This is a perspective of Black excellence in hospitality. So I could have done 3 volumes of this, right? But I wanted us to show that it's pluralistic and it's not monolithic. Very often Black art gets narrowed down to one thing, and it's everything but that. So as a Black creative, we wanted to show that, yes, our journey is complicated, it's layered, but let's talk about it. There lies the beauty. If you're Haitian American, you cook very different than somebody that came up through the Great Migration, where your roots are maybe from, your grandparents' roots could be from South Carolina and you moved up to Detroit. If you're Ethiopian Americans, your roots are very, very different than the Miss Tiana G that is Filipino and African American. So we wanted to show that the beauty of North America and its culture into the Black race, it's the history was not written by us, but we hear now. It's layered, it's complicated, but that's what makes all of us in America so unique. We can celebrate it.
The history not being written by us is something that comes up a lot in the book. And there's a quote I wanted to talk a little bit about here. In one passage, this jumped out to us. It said, Thomas Jefferson is credited with bringing French cooking to America. But let's remember that it was Jefferson's enslaved cook, James Hemings, who actually trained to be a chef in Paris. What is the broader significance of a story like that?
Well, it's what we talk about a lot in the book is authorship, right? Memory and aspirations. If your authorship is always taken away, if you're written out of the history, it's hard for you as a family, as a non-Black, as a Black family, to start thinking about the memories around it, because history matters, documentation matters, and that allows us then to create aspirations, saying to kids, go into these fields, or you as a parent or as a person say, hey, I really appreciate what this culture brought to this field. But if we're constantly anonymous and only viewed as labor, you can't celebrate. And that's very important. We have to celebrate each other.
We don't look at food in the same way we might look as a artifact of history, as a way of telling stories about people, in the way that we might look at a literature, the way we might look at music or something like that.
And nothing could be further from the truth, right? Because you're absolutely right. But food was the first thing there was the first Wall Street, right? The markets, the Damascus market, the Marrakesh markets, there was these global big marketplaces, right? And we traded food, raw materials. And even that, Africa gets written out. You know, when you think about great chocolate from Belgium, my question is always, there's no cocoa beans in Belgium, they're in Ghana. When you think about the great Italian roasted coffee, the coffee comes from Ethiopia. So these kind of shifts need to be shifted back to its origin, because the way we appreciate a great Mercedes from Germany is also how we should appreciate coffee from Ethiopia, chocolate from Ghana. And it allows us then to trade and allows us to speak about cultures in a greater term versus just sending aid and how come Africa and people of color is always poor.
I'm glad you brought up Ethiopia, because you are of Ethiopian descent, and the Ethiopian culinary tradition features prominently in this book as well. You have new interpretations of age-old recipes like shiro and dorowet. What's the relationship you see between traditional African-American cooking and culinary traditions from Africa?
Well, I love that. You know, I would say the first thing is oral storytelling, right? When my wife cooks and her sister cooks, there's no recipes. There are rituals that are passed down from aunties and mothers and generations of great cooks that never considered themselves being chefs. But it was something, knowing how to make fresh cheese, knowing how to make bread. It's something that my wife and her sisters, it's part of being Ethiopian. They know how to do this, right? They would never consider themselves chefs. It's just part of who they are, just as much as it's part of us to maybe watch the Super Bowl or something like that, right? Or have Thanksgiving. So I would say the oral tradition of cooking.
You see that, and tell me then how you see that play itself out in the United States.
Well, I mean, you think about when the enslaved people came over, there was no recipes. Very often they didn't learn how to write or read, but still there was recipes that we still trade off and rituals that we still trade off today. So how do the art of making barbecue? You think about the Gullah people and the low country cuisine, grits, rice. They are very similar to the broken rice out of West Africa. So those oral tradition, although people were shipped on ship, they kept them. They brought with them okra, peanuts, all these traditions were brought, and rituals. We talk often about recipes. Rituals are much older than recipes.
Food can be a way of telling history, as we talked about earlier. Food can also be a way of experiencing deep emotion. Mm-hmm. Can you think of a recipe in this book that you tasted or you prepared or you investigated that perhaps, I mean, I can tell by looking at you right now, brought something like that to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think this year, 2020, globally, we're going through something that it's almost a reset.
Yeah.
And there is, for me, it's connected to spirituality, not a specific religion, but maybe there is somebody saying, hey, we need to reset a little bit. And I feel like food, we've completely failed as people in terms of racial relationships. We tried everything. We're on the eve of a new beginning in America, and it will have impact all over the world. But we have to culturally start seeing each other from a different point of view. And I do think that food and music are two great windows in. Think about what we learned through music, right? If we start looking at food the same way, we can learn so much more about each other and being curious about one another. What an incredible, delicious way to have a conversation during these holidays about race in a delicious way, about cooking from a culture that may or not be yours.
It's been described as an undeniable path to empathy, both music and food.
Mm-hmm. And I love that, right? And empathy is a word that, the way pivot was the word for this year, empathy maybe should be the word of 2021, right? And it doesn't cost anything to have empathy. It doesn't cost anything to be curious. And I think we need to go back to curiosity and empathy, because if we do that and we start cooking with one another, whether we do it through Zoom, whether we do it through FaceTime, because we can't be together, that will all lead to a better place, because we tried everything else, and we cannot be more polarized than we've been. So now we got to come back together and heal, and food can be part of that.
What a moment. I mean, given the murder of George Floyd, given the reckoning happening in the United States, what a moment for this book to come out, Marcus.
Well, yes, but this book was started 4 years ago.
Well, of course, it's like everything, these things that are perfect for this moment come before,
And that's really this year for me has been a very productive year in terms of creative. Although I couldn't be creative through my restaurant in the same way, right? I could work, but I couldn't be as creative cooking-wise, right? So I partnered with Jose to serve World Central Kitchen, and we served about 1,500 people to 1,200 people a day. That was pure labor and something I had to do. In my podcast, This Moment, that I have with my friend Jason Diakite, we started that podcast because we needed to process this moment. We, as two creative, didn't know what are we going to do? Everything that we knew as normal was taken away from us. How do we navigate? So we both started this podcast as a receipt of this time, but also as a healing process. And I think as creative, that's what's going to come out of this. I think 21, 22, 23, we'll see incredible art, incredible music, incredible food coming out, because we all need to heal, and it's going to look and taste different depending on what creativity your journey is about. But I do think there will be a creative renaissance coming out of this.
What's a recipe in this book you wish, for any reason, everyone would cook?
Wow. I do think that there is an aguachile that one might not relate to Black cooking, but it talks about an anonymous chef. He or she didn't want to give their name up. Talks about being Black in Mexico, coming to America as an legal, and we don't think about both of those things, right? Black food in terms of the impact of Mexico and Southern California. And then we always think about it as this narrow thing, and that's what this book really talks about. But also, of course, gumbo, Miss Leah Chase. We do this. This book wouldn't have happened without the incredible Black women has been the backbone of American food. So when I think about Miss Leah Chase that just passed away when we did the book, I think about Edna Lewis, think about Alberta Wright, Sophia Wright, that was there for Lyndon B. Johnson and cooked for Lyndon B. Johnson, that these are food activists. Not always do you think about chefs as activists, but that's exactly what Leah's generation were. And today, we learned what chefs can also be first responders. We were first responders in the middle of the COVID pandemic. So I've learned that being a chef can mean far many different things than just being in a kitchen in a restaurant.
You seem yourself changed by making this book, Marcus.
I think that the era that we just had with Trump, with the pandemic, with the polarization, as a chef, as a Black chef, I was asking myself, I needed to find my voice in the book, and that's why it took such a long time. What is this all for? Why are these challenges put in front of us? Why is it that we can have, self-driven cars, but we can't figure out on a human level how to talk to one another? So as a chef, I just felt let's look in the past, let's be in the present, and then let's do something for the future. And chefs always, it's called breaking bread, right? Restaurant means restore your community. So I was asking myself these questions. Well, what did it mean to be a Black chef in Harlem at this time? What did all the rhetorics from the politician, how did I answer and deal with that? And for me, it goes back to food, bringing people together, and that's what the Rice does. And share stories.
It's a beautiful story. I love talking to you about this book. I am going to close out like this. Early in the conversation, we talked a little bit about Thomas Jefferson and his chef, and then we go to you cooking the first state dinner for the first Black president. Just tell me something. What do you remember? I want to know a memory, a story you remember from that day cooking for Obama.
Oh, it was an amazing day. And Sam Cass, that was the executive chef for Mr. Obama, President Obama, and First Lady Michelle Obama, said, Marcus, this day will always be with you. You don't realize it now because you're in the middle of it. This day will always be with you for the rest of your life. And he realized how big the moment were, and I didn't, right? And the other thing that I remember is I called my mom, and I was across from the Oval Office and said, hey, I'm at the White House, so excited. I'm going to do this big dinner tonight. She's like, Marcus, your father would not have agreed. You cannot embarrass yourself. Your name is Samuelsson. If you can still leave now.
What? Why? What do you mean?
I know. Oh. She got so nervous for me. My sisters told her, do not call Marcus today. He has a big day. And she was so curious. She wanted to know what it was. So I was like, rather than getting called from my mom, I was like, all right, I'm going to jumpstart it. I'm just going to call and let her know. And she got so nervous for me. And that's
Get out.
Like, get out.
What was your favorite thing you cooked for him?
I think it was the bread course. It was for Prime Minister Singh and obviously Barack Obama. And the bread course was all about breaking bread. I envisioned in my head all these politicians not knowing each other, but they had to break bread. So we did an Indian chapati and American cornbread on the same platter. And I was just watching these politicians without the servers passing around the bread, breaking literally bread. We made it so it would be a little bit uncomfortable for them because I had to break bread.
Marcus, what a joy to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much. Thank you.